All right, well, let's get started. It looks like folks are slow to get signed in today, but we'll go ahead and start with housekeeping, and then I presume some of the 36 or so folks who are registered will continue dialing in the next few minutes. So again, welcome to the BALLE Live webinar series on Local First, and the fifth in our mini-series on local procurement. My name is Alyssa Barron-Menza, and I serve as Director of Spreading Solutions at BALLE. We have several dozen communities from across North America registered for today's webinar, and we're delighted to have you each with us. I'm going to review a bit of housekeeping, provide a few reminders about this series, and then we'll introduce our topic and speakers for today. So if you're dialed in by phone, but you've not yet joined us in the webinar room, you can find a link in your reminder email from Allie Walker. Because of the number of webinar participants, we have the phone line muted. If you have a question for the presenters at any time during the webinar, you can type your question in the public chat window. They may answer a question during their presentation, but will hold most questions to the end of the webinar when we have time set aside for moderated Q&A. If you have technical difficulties at any point, you can note that in the chat window, and our staff member, Mikel Davila, will send you a private chat to help you get sorted out. The private chat will show up as a new tab to the right of the public chat window in the top right corner of your screen, which will flash red once the private chat has been initiated by Mikel. After each webinar, we email everyone registered a link to a full recording of the webinar along with the presentation slides and a copy of the questions from the chat. So you can watch for these materials in an email from Mikel over the next few days. So right now, in our Local First series, we're doing a deep dive on local procurement. As many of you know, you've joined us for a number of these webinars. In the U.S., as much as 6% of GDP comes from the spending of just two kinds of anchor institutions: medical institutions like hospitals and higher education institutions. So while consumer-focused Local First work is critically important, we want to continue focusing on the huge portion of our economy that is beyond consumer spending, including institutional spending. We're talking the potential for hundreds of millions of dollars in buying power we can redirect to local enterprises. So we see this as a growing area of our work. So in addition to these webinars, we'll be hosting a workshop on local procurement at our conference in June, and we will be doing ongoing resource development, assessment, and storytelling in the area of local procurement. So you can find out more about our conference workshop at www.bealocalist.org. And then we are working on our April, May, and July webinar topics as well as through the rest of the year. But I can give you a sneak peek that we will be focusing for the next few months on food procurement, that is getting food into institutions and into retail. So with our first several local procurement webinars, we set about exploring what's possible. Why should we all care about procurement, much less consider taking it on? What can be accomplished in a few years of focused effort and over the medium term? So these first few webinars explored successful examples from Phoenix on local government procurement and Cleveland and Detroit for medical institutions and universities. So those webinars are available for purchase on our website, and they're free in our member library for our champion members. If you participated live, of course, the recording is free and included with your registration. Then last month, we paused to take a step back from any one example to reflect about advancing local procurement broadly. We looked at how the local procurement ecosystem works and the drivers of the procurement process for different kinds of institutions that we want to influence. So today we're back with Ted Howard and Steve Dubb to explore green procurement and supplier diversity as leverage strategies for local procurement. These two procurement lenses, as we'll hear today, have more widespread traction and more of a track record than local purchasing, and yet they can often help us achieve some of the same goals, which would be more of the procurement pie going to locally owned, socially responsible, community-serving businesses. So our speakers again today are Ted Howard, Executive Director of the Democracy Collaborative, and Steve Dubb, their Research Director. And if you haven't figured it out already, these guys are some of our key mentors and teachers in this burgeoning exploration of procurement. Their interest at Democracy Collaborative is in spreading community wealth building strategies, including local and sustainable procurement, to more places. They're great resources, and I encourage you to bring all of your questions forward today so we can be in discussion and learning together. So with that, I am going to turn it over to you, Ted, to take us away.
Great. Thank you, Alyssa, and hello, everybody. For those of you that have been on these webinars before with Steve and I, We welcome you back, and I guess hopefully it shows we're doing something right, that you keep returning. As the first slide says, today's topic is really about anchor institutions and local procurement again, and we're going to focus on green procurement and supplier diversity. We're going to cover the following, some key themes related to both of these types of procurement, green and supplier. We're going to then dive into supplier diversity with some very specific examples, as well as green procurement. Steve Dubb, our research director at the Democracy Collaborative, who's really on top of these best practices and case studies, will be leading through that part of the presentation. And then I'll come back to discuss Cleveland's Vision 2010 example, which is a very interesting hospital example that did link supplier diversity to local procurement in a quite innovative way that we think is a model for institutions around the country. We've recently done a case study on that, and I'll talk about that more. So to begin, supplier diversity has its roots in the early 1970s, but it's really exploded in the 1990s. As it says, much of this is around construction. When there are large construction projects, the owners, otherwise known as the university or the hospital of the project, will often mandate their major construction company that a certain percentage of the subcontracts need to go to, in particular, minority and female-owned firms, an MBE or an FBE. Most hospitals and universities that I encounter, and obviously I don't have a full national sample, but in our work at the Collaborative in Pittsburgh and Washington, D.C., and Cleveland, and many other cities, Atlanta, most of these institutions have a dedicated office for supplier diversity. And that office is not only charged with ensuring the institution hits its targets, but actually working with smaller minority and female-owned businesses to ensure that they can succeed in working with a university or a hospital, a major institution. And in order to do that, and I think Steve will go into some of this, institutions often find that they may be used to letting $10 and $20 million contracts, but in order to get minority and female-owned companies, smaller companies into the game, the institutions need to be willing to do a number of things, to break down projects into sort of bite-sized contracts so that maybe a firm could get a contract for $50,000 or $100,000 as part of a bigger $10 million effort. There are things like retainage and rate of payment. A lot of institutions are used to having all the work done and paying their vendor on the back end. That obviously doesn't work for a small business. So they've needed to change a number of their practices in that regard, and we could talk about that if others are interested. Green procurement is a more recent development. It's really come out of the sustainability movement, the environmental movement, increasingly out of concerns with climate change and climate mitigation. And that's really come in the 1990s and actually really in the 2000s. Again, many institutions I'm familiar with have dedicated offices for sustainability that have been put in place in the last 10 years. And they really look at the entire supply chain of the institution and try to find targets of opportunity where they can, as it said, green the supply chain. Where, for instance, maybe a hospital has been having its medical waste picked up by the large, international firm Waste Management and taken to the dump, and just thrown away. The procurement officers, the green procurement officers, will look to see how can they take parts of that waste stream and actually recycle and reuse it with different vendors. With a few exceptions, and local foods being one of those, as we'll talk about, supplier diversity and green procurement are mostly not explicitly linked to buying local. So a hospital may often be very happy to have a minority-owned firm vendor the hospital might be based in Pittsburgh, but the vendor's based in Chicago. But given the way they score these things, if they don't emphasize locality, they're willing to take a vendor from quite far away if that vendor meets the MBE or the FBE requirements. However, a lot of institutions also, I'm thinking, I had a meeting recently with UPMC, the University of Pittsburgh Medical Center, which doesn't have specific local targets, but when they calculate how many minority-owned firms they're using, almost all of them are small minority-owned firms that are based locally around Cleveland. So it does drive the local conversation. And as it says, the importance for those of you in BALLE, I think, is that institutions have embraced supplier diversity and green procurement really sort of provides not only evidence but a rationale for moving forward into actual explicit localizing of their supply chain. So we're going to talk first about some key points about supplier diversity before we get into some examples. As I mentioned, supplier diversity is generally thought of as MBE and FBE or WBE for women-owned business enterprises. Many institutions try to target, for instance, at least 15% of their contracts going to MBEs and usually less, 5% or so going to W or FBEs. And they're the definitions that most institutions are using right now. It is interesting that some localities are now beginning to use an SBE, or Small Business Enterprise designation. I was just meeting with a group who visited us in Cleveland from Chicago, and apparently in Chicago there had actually been some legal action around the question of, are you inappropriately providing preferences by using an MBE or WBE designation? So the city is embracing an SBE designation, knowing that most of those small business enterprises locally are going to be minority and women-owned businesses. And as it says also, some institutions, the Veterans Administration, for instance, is particularly concerned with disabled veterans in letting contracts and require that as part of their contracting designation. So a few trends. Interestingly, most of us think that the feds don't have these sorts of localizing or small business requirements, but indeed they do. Since 1993, grants and contracts have mandated that recipients take steps to at least reach out to and include small businesses, minority firms, women-owned firms, and so forth whenever possible. It's not an absolute requirement, but it has had an impact. Another thing, within the institutions, there is just growing internal support for these kinds of things. Whenever I meet with anchor institutions, much of what they lead with is how much of their business is going to minority-owned firms, for instance, or local firms. I was on a panel here in Memphis at the Funders Network yesterday with a senior representative of Johns Hopkins University, and much of the discussion was their commitment, particularly, again, in construction, to drive business to local minority-owned firms. And then there are some growing examples of multi-institutional efforts that are moving into this supplier diversity area. So with that, I'd like to turn this over to Steve. He's going to walk you through about 8 or so examples of where institutions are doing some creative things, and then we'll circle back to Cleveland, and then we'll open it up to questions. So Steve?
Okay. Thanks to BALLE and to Alyssa for making these seminars possible. What I thought I would do is go through some different types of examples and different types of institutions. So last month when we presented, we actually had a couple examples, and they're very common ones, University of Pennsylvania, Ivy League school, and University of Minnesota, which is a land-grant college. So here's some more different institutional examples. So this is Miami-Dade College. It's a community college, and they use an approach which some institutions use of actually having a dedicated office focused on minority and small business enterprise. They're not alone. In Washington, D.C., you have the District of Columbia City Government that also has a similar type of office. And Miami-Dade has a very strong track record. They started the program in 1994. And one of the practices I wanted to highlight was this idea of a reverse trade show. It's a very effective practice of actually reaching out and inviting minority and business enterprise vendors to come to an event rather than wait for procurement officers to come to their event. And it's really proved to be an effective technique, and actually University of Pennsylvania and other institutions are also adopting this procedure. And you can see that they've gotten 20 to 27%, it varies by year, of total Miami-Dade College procurement, which is, quite a high figure. So moving on to, here we go. And Syracuse, again, different school, private university in upstate New York. Here it's a mainline program, much more like, say, University of Pennsylvania than like Miami-Dade. So rather than have a separate office for minority and women contracting, they actually integrate it with the overall goals of the program. And one key thing here to point out is the focus on follow-up and mentoring of businesses over time. And there's this quote from Eric Dade, the director of campus planning, that there is a systematic process of post-bid follow-up with minority vendors and local vendors that don't succeed to build this capacity over time. And numbers here, you got 17 firms hired to work on 24 projects, 8% total procurement. Not as high of a percentage, but bear in mind this is upstate New York and not Miami-Dade County, so a reasonably high level of achievement for their community. So those are a couple university examples, and here are a couple hospital examples. And one of which is from Secours. Secours is a Catholic hospital system. They actually have 8 or 9 branch hospitals, if you will, across the east coast of the United States. And they they have a long track record of doing community involvement, but hadn't really integrated their purchasing. They launched their effort in 2011, and the first step was to identify, and we talked about this last time, about the role of group purchasing organizations, which often leads to contracts that are at such a scale that becomes inaccessible for any kind of local provider. And so they identified that more than half of the spending at their Baltimore hospital could be potentially relocalized. And they've set some modest goals, but they are making progress, shifted $2 million of business in the first year, going from 4 to 6% of total procurement, and aim to get up to 9% in the near future. And let's see. And one more hospital example, supply chain, Henry Ford Health System in Detroit, Michigan. One major change was to actually post bids, and this is important because, as we discussed last time, a lot of procurement is relational, and goes to the friends of the contracting officers, or friends might be stating it too strongly, but people which they have a trusted vendors they have a trusted relationship with. And what that means often is it goes to majority vendors. So to get procurement officers, purchasing officers out of their comfort zone, this kind of sourcing policy is quite effective. They've set a goal of $100 million in purchasing. They've already up to $86 million, and they've built relationships with 600 suppliers. Fairly impressive. And this last point about Source Detroit, also important to note, that this is a multi-anchor institution partnership. So Detroit-wide, it's not just Henry Ford Health System, it's also Detroit Medical Center and Wayne State University. And so combined, there's an effort to drive up purchasing locally. It's still early days, but they have shifted $16 million in purchasing and contracts to date, with the promise of doing a lot more over time. So I think the thing to take from, sort of the main takeaway to take from the discussion of supply chain and diversity supply is that there are a lot of different examples, and you could certainly find examples in your community as well. Green procurement is a bit newer, but is expanding rapidly. There are actually trade associations that actually that rate green procurement. There's a group in the healthcare hospital industry called Practice Green Health that rates hospitals on their green procurement approaches. Within higher education, there's an organization called the Association for the Advancement for Sustainability in Higher Education, or ASHE, AASHE. And so you can actually look up institutions potentially. There's more than 200 universities rated, for example, in your community to get a sense of what they are doing already and link into that. So what are some of the trends? Well, in hospitals in particular, there's the goal of mitigating environmental harm. And this is because, as an EPA study found in 1990s, healthcare, the sector that's responsible for keeping us well, was actually the nation's third leading source of dioxin emissions, and in general a major source of healthcare hazards because of the industry's waste practices at the time. So there's been a real effort within the hospital industry to mitigate that, and significant progress over the last 15 years. There are additional reasons why you see efforts at green procurement. Just to highlight two of those quickly. One is to reduce costs. Energy conservation savings can be significant, and I believe that Henry Ford Hospital, claims to have saved something on the order of $1 billion in energy costs by doing this. So there are potentials to actually save considerable amount of money while doing green procurement, and that obviously involves a reduction in ongoing energy costs, but it involves contracts in the short run to actually make those adjustments in terms of energy efficiency. There's also the drive to address climate change, and several hundred campus presidents have signed president's commitment for climate change within the university sector. There are similar movements within the hospital sector, and obviously that becomes, in particular, a driver for buy local initiatives that reduce transportation miles. So speaking of which, Emory University, Emory has, takes pride in, at least as of 2009, they had more square feet of LEED certified buildings than any other U.S. college. They've also set this goal of local produce production, and the Democracy Collaborative has actually been involved in work in Atlanta and doing a feasibility study, building off the work that we've done in Cleveland. And what we found in our market research was that Emory had set this goal of, they may have reduced it to 70%, but 70 or 75% of produce to be purchased within the state. And even in the summer, they don't get beyond 50% and roughly 30% year-wide. So the university, and Emory is actually a university and hospital system, has helped sponsor the development of a local greenhouse cooperative that's under development in Atlanta. Hopefully will open in the next 12 months. That'll be employee-owned, locally based, as a stepping stone into moving from that 30% figure to the 70-75% figure. Yale, another Ivy League school like Penn, that's focused on carbon reduction as well. Set of 43% reduction goal by 2020, is doing green building as well. And one interesting step that they took was to bring their dining services in-house. So they're trying to drive $11 million in food purchasing local, at least get 60% of that. As of 2010, they were at 25%. And it's a challenge. It requires work both. So it's a huge step for the trend in hospitals and universities. Clearly has been outsourcing of dining services. So it's a big move by Yale to actually bring it in-house, to in-source it. The challenge that they've been finding is about getting the local producers to produce at the quantities and with the quality requirements of Yale on the production scale that they need, which leads well to our next example, Gundersen-Luthernan, where they actually, this is a healthcare system in Wisconsin and a little bit of Minnesota as well, and they actually created a multi-stakeholder farmer-consumer cooperative where the consumers include the hospital, the health system itself, basically to create a system where there are credible commitments by the hospital to actually purchase, because it's really easy for local farmers to plant crops thinking they're selling to the hospital and then not actually have the purchase at the end, in which case they lose a ton of money. So the cooperative structure helps negotiate that on the front end so that both the health system and the local farmers benefit. In addition to their work on local food production, they've also set a very impressive, and we'll see if they meet it, goal of sourcing 100% of their energy locally by 2014. So let's see, and this brings us back to Cleveland, and I'll let Ted take the lead from here.
Great, thank you, Steve. Thanks for all those great examples. So we're going to conclude with just one additional example that was quite innovative in Cleveland, and it was undertaken by the University Hospitals, which is one of the major hospital systems in Cleveland, along with the Cleveland Clinic. And on this first slide, you see part of the cover of a case study that I wrote with two colleagues from MIT's Department of Urban Studies and Planning, as it says. This report, by the way, can be downloaded from the Democracy Collaborative's research website, which is community-wealth.org, community-wealth.org. It's on the homepage. So what was Vision 2010? University Hospitals in 2005 was faced with a major expansion of its physical plant. It dedicated $1.2 billion over a 5-year period toward construction of a whole set of new buildings. Of that $1.2 billion, about $800 million went into actual bricks and mortar construction, cancer hospital and parking garages and so forth. But about $400 million went into other services, including buying the beds and furniture and all the equipment that was needed to fill up those buildings. So $1.2 billion. The normal way an institution would have approached this was to find a general contractor, a large construction company, hired them, told them, we want these buildings in these locations on this timeline, and we've got this much money, and go forth and do it. They might have said, and use as many minority-owned firms as you can, but it's all up to you. University hospitals didn't want to do that, and the reason they didn't want to is because they are firmly rooted as an anchor in Northeast Ohio. And as they look at their business model looking out, they notice, for instance, that in past decades, including this last decade, every decade, Northeast Ohio and Cleveland is losing population. So the population is down now to about 396,000 people. A couple decades ago, it was up in the 800 to 900,000 range. So they were very clear, we have got to keep people in this region if we want to continue to be a profitable business, even a nonprofit profitable business. And one way they thought they could help encourage that is to drive money into the local economy to put people to work, to reinforce local businesses, to get people who are local to work on the construction jobs and so forth. And so that's what Vision 2010 was. It was a city and regional Northeast Ohio strategy to inject as much of the $1.2 billion locally as was possible. And it required, as you can imagine, extraordinary effort on the part of university hospitals. They were under no requirement to do this. It's not that they had to abide by city laws. This is entirely voluntary. to try to begin a new business model. And so the core commitments of Vision 2010 were, one, to contract with as many minority and female-owned firms as possible, to direct as much spending as possible into the region. And interestingly, as this process developed, university hospitals leaders bought into a new vision, not one they started with, but they realized that their example could change the dynamic for what is considered appropriate business practice in Northeast Ohio and create, if you will, a new normal. That if you're a large institution, for-profit or nonprofit, based in Northeast Ohio, the way to conduct your business is to really give a preference to the local businesses in your community and help build them up and get people back to work and provide more economic opportunity and inclusion. So there are very specific targets set. This is from the case study that you can download online. It was a 5% FTE women-owned business. They achieved 7%. Minority-owned firms, 15%. They achieved 17%. But you see down at the bottom there, they, in terms of construction workers, they wanted 20% of the people who worked on construction to be certified as Cleveland residents. They achieved 18%. It's a very complicated story why that is. It has to do with historic practices, within unions and union membership, because this was a union construction job and there weren't a lot of minorities at the front of the bench in the unions and so forth. But the really important target was they committed 80% of their $1.2 billion going into the regional economy with businesses that were certified not as a P.O. box where an invoice would go to or a purchase order would go to, but literally businesses that were certified. They were based in Northeast Ohio. They were owned in Northeast Ohio, and the commitment was 80%. In fact, they achieved 92% of that $1.2 billion, a very significant injection of $1 billion into the regional economy. And this was at a time when there was not much going on in Northeast Ohio. There were no cranes in the air constructing anything except what University Hospital was doing. It was the time of the foreclosure crisis. The Great Recession came. So the driver in the local economy was literally this project. Before mentioning this slide, let me just say that, when we did the case study and sort of assessed what does it take for an institution to do this kind of thing, because this really is outside of the normal business practice. And these were some of the things we found, that it was essential to build a vision and build it internally in the culture and get literally hundreds and hundreds of leaders of the institution bought into why they were going to conduct business this way, even though it was more challenging than their normal procedures. Benchmarking what they were going for, setting clear metrics, and then indeed they hired a third-party outside firm called Minority Business Solutions, which certified that these targets were hit. This wasn't just window dressing, but indeed they certified that these really were legitimately minority-owned companies, not just a face in the front of the business, and rooted in the community. That required a lot of community outreach and engagement. There were many community fora where local business leaders would come and understand what this opportunity was all about, and so forth. The really interesting thing about this to me is that having achieved this really wonderful accomplishment, and one we think is worthy of other institutions considering, and that's why we put all the effort into writing this case study, university hospitals decided to take the next step, which was to say, we're not going to be satisfied with this wonderful accomplishment that took place over a 5-year period and then go back to normal business. Now, we're not doing any more construction, but what can we do? And they've decided voluntarily to take those same metrics and now integrate them in their entire supply chain, which on an annual basis is about $850 to $900 million. And again, ensure that at least 80% of that money year in, year out is going to businesses based locally and minority business, small businesses and the like. So that's the real change that happened institutionally. And the city of Cleveland and its mayor has now built upon that. And a new community benefits agreement has been negotiated in the city of Cleveland, which has these same metrics and measures in them. So it really did achieve what they wanted, which is to begin to change how business is done in the city of Cleveland. Here are some resources that the Democracy Collaborative has published. Most all of this is downloadable from our website at that address. And I think, Alicia, with that, Steve and I have said our piece, and we're happy to take questions if anyone has them.
Great. I have a series of questions which I'll serve up here as participants note their questions in the chat window. But we have an initial question from Terry Link, who's been to a number of these webinars, and he's wondering if there's any connection of the responsible purchasing network into any of this work. And so I'm going to put in the chat window here a little bit of information I pulled from the web on Responsible Purchasing Network. But is that a network that you guys are familiar with at the Democracy Collaborative? And if so, are they connected to any of these examples or to you guys?
It is, and this is Ted. It is a network we're familiar with, and we've met with some of their folks in the past, and obviously they did a really interesting eco-purchasing book. It's on their website, and we've used that book. It's very well done. I have to say, I haven't asked people that I meet in the Supplier Diversity and green purchasing anchor world if they're members of Responsible Purchasing. I know if you go to their website, you can see their member directory, and you could find the institutions that have somebody involved. That would probably be a very good way of entry, by the way, is to look at which institutions in your community have members, are members of RPN and the people, and seek them out. Steve, do you have other information?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I mentioned more the sectoral organizations, but Responsible Purchasing Network, which is kind of nice about them, is they do cross a lot of different sectors. Just scanning their membership list, I saw that Yale is a member, for example. So they, so clearly that's another resource for sort of finding out, who is doing this work in your community.
Yep.
All right, thank you guys. And Terry, if you have any additional information about or experience you've had with RPN, we welcome hearing about that in the chat window. So one thing that has struck me, as we've walked through this mini-series and as we listen to you guys speak today, Ted and Steve, is the role of this kind of champion, whether you're working with, food procurement or whether you're working in, with hospitals and universities on, broad swath of procurement on our particular project, like you've talked about in Cleveland with the university health system. There's some catalyst or set of catalyst organizations that are really kind of bringing these ideas to the table, because really what we're talking about is as you talked about again in Cleveland, a real change in the way that we do business. So can you guys reflect on that role for kind of a catalyst organization, and for example, some of what, how you position yourselves in that way, and then work with others to do the same.
Sure. Steve, would you like to start with that?
Let's see. What can
Or I can.
Why don't you start, Ted, on that one?
Sure. Well, it's interesting you asked this because I was just yesterday, as I mentioned here, at the Funders Network conference in Memphis, and did a panel on anchor institutions for about 40 or 50 funders. And one of the things I point out is they, as place-based funders, and indeed sort of local anchors, if you're the Cleveland Foundation or the Gunn Foundation, you're not funding in Phoenix, you're funding in Cleveland and surrounding counties. And that they have, these funders have a tremendous opportunity to build this vision for why local procurement is a positive thing and why anchor institutions should get into it, and they can bring these institutions to the table. I know where Steve and I've worked on community wealth building strategies that have anchors involved. There has always been a funder or group of funders that have been instrumental in convening and encouraging institutions to come to the table. So one thing I'd suggest is, the power of these, community or local funders to set a table and provide information on local procurement strategies of the kind Steve and I just did. A lot of institutions are unaware of all this, and then bring institutions together to explore how they might work together on local procurement. I know that's very, very effective. Steve, what else would you say?
Well, there are, funders are certainly one approach, and I think a powerful one. Sometimes you can get an approach where the institutions themselves take more of a leadership role, and I think about Cincinnati, for example. We had the Uptown Consortium formed, which involved the zoo, actually, and 3 hospitals and the University of Cincinnati. And there, I think the University of Cincinnati, back when Nancy Zimfer was president, took a leadership role in sort of bringing the other institutions to the table and sort of looking at their supply chains and as well as other investments in community development. And so I think certainly funders can launch that discussion, but I also think there are different networks where this discussion can occur, easily through the different institutions, as well as through some of these specialty trade associations that are focused on sustainability or supplier diversity issues. So I think there are a lot of different points of entry. I know in Pittsburgh, Duquesne University on its own decided that they wanted to do this work, and we ended up working with Duquesne on a feasibility study there in Pittsburgh. So a lot of different points of entry, and I think it's really about knowing your community, whether the funder route will work best or some other route.
Mm-hmm. Good.
Great, thank you. We've also had a question from John about attitudinal pushbacks in working with anchor institutions. So I was just typing here in the chat room that, I think we had some great examples about kind of attitudinal issues to work through in Phoenix on the local government side and Detroit on the anchor side. And then, of course, last month with the two of you as speakers, we really dove into institutional drivers, from laws to common cultural issues with anchor institutions, with universities, hospitals, different kinds of institutions. So I would refer folks to those webinar recordings or slides. But, Steve and Ted, could you recap a little bit of that for folks who might not have been with us on the journey yet? Maybe what are some of the barriers in initially getting, an anchor to the table and talking about local procurement, and maybe speak a little bit more about, some of the, the kind of attitudes that may be in place that we're working to address.
Okay, well, I can take a shot at this.
Yeah.
Ted, you can jump in.
Okay.
So, the barriers are fairly obvious, and there's, the biggest barrier, I think, is really inertia. So it's just not the way that business is done. So there are established relationships with vendors. There's group purchasing organizations. So one is just the established relationships and breaking through those. A second has to do with these group purchasing organizations, and more broadly, the fact that a lot of these procurement contracts are 5 or 10 years in length. So there's a lot of unwinding that has to happen. And last time we talked a bit about that history and how those institutions developed over time. So those are a couple key barriers. And then, there is a lot of, I guess I would call it bureaucratic thinking. So that was some of the legal discussion that we had last time. There certainly may be laws in place that say, for example, that state agencies can't give preference points. And then, the simple thing is say, well, therefore we can't do anything, which doesn't follow. you can do mentoring, you can do reverse trade shows, you can reduce the amount of the contracts so they're more accessible. You can publicize small contracts so that people know about them and can bid on them. None of those things involve preference points, all these things are effective. So that's sort of some of the key barriers. In terms of ways to address those barriers, we did talk about the drivers last time, and they vary. I think with local governments, what the perhaps most effective argument that can be made is to show that by employing local people, you're generating local revenue and therefore local tax dollars for the city or county government. And that was that concept of total least cost we talked about last time. With hospitals, we've talked a little bit today about some of the drivers in terms of creating a healthy environment and recognizing that the economic climate of the surrounding community affects health outcomes. With universities, I think there is a engagement tradition that can be that the university is supposed to be attached and supporting the local community that can be a driver in addition to themes that we covered today. So those are some thoughts, and I'll let Pat fill in the blanks from there.
I don't. Thanks, Steve. I don't think I have anything to add. That covered it really well.
Thank you. So we've got existing relationships, hey, these are folks I already know. I've worked with them. We've got databases. That's come up a number of different months. This is the place I go that I trust for my information. And so unless you can kind of replace, my existing database with a, new, database of different kinds of suppliers, that's an issue. You talked about the group purchasing organizations and then the length of these contracts, 5 or 10 years, as well as the need to really just shift in thinking. This isn't just about preference points, but even if it were, this is also really about really making the case, and this is where I think you guys mentioned the real power of community funders, place-based funders, or other catalysts to bring folks to the table is really talking about the economic impact in terms of job creation, and in terms of local economic development. There's some real remessaging we've got to do. So does that sound like a fair recap, Steve?
Yeah.
Great.
That was really well done. If you decide to leave BALLE and want to come to work with us on local procurement, at least, give me a call.
All right. Well, thank you, guys. Well, I welcome some additional questions if folks have them.
I mean that, Michelle. If you're listening to this tape, I was only kidding.
Yes, right.
Really,
yes.
It does very.
Yes. Well, we need as many institutions as possible. I think doing this work, and so I encourage folks as you're thinking about questions, feel free to ask questions not only about our specific topics for today, but broadly, because as I mentioned, we've really been using the Democracy Collaborative to help catalyze our own learning and kind of figure out who else is, who else is really leading in this space. So we've got a very big question from Mikal about examples of areas of difficulties for anchor institutions on procuring locally and possible market opportunities for women and minority-owned businesses, small business enterprises. So I would say that to fully answer that would be kind of recapping our session, but maybe to recap a particular piece of this here, talk about, I gave a few statistics that come from you guys in my early talking points about the market share that we're really talking about when we're looking at, localizing procurement, and when we're also looking at bringing more procurement to, women-owned businesses and minority-owned businesses. So talk to us in numbers. What kind of market share are we really talking about here?
Well, we've given, a figure, nationally, if you take the, let's say, 4,000 to 5,000, universities and colleges, and then you take the 5,000 to 6,000 hospitals, and you put all that procurement together, it's something around or north of $1 trillion, which is an enormous amount of money. Now, we need to say it's, a good amount of that is probably never going to be driven locally, and there are all kinds of issues. But I think it's important to get our heads around as a conceptual matter that at this time of enormous resource constraint, every city's pleading it's broke, the sequesters happening, all of these things are happening. Nonetheless, on a yearly basis, kind of year in, year out, even, with all the different politics and so forth, there's $1 trillion flowing through these place-based institutions. And then if you break it down into a city, you get to a city like Cleveland, which is, a mid-sized city, as I said, a little under 400,000 people, and just 3 of the big anchors, the Cleveland Clinic, University Hospitals, and Case Western, purchase over $3 billion of goods and services every year. And that doesn't include the city government. It doesn't include the community college, Cleveland State University, Metro Health Hospital, the Art Museum, and on and on and on. So even in a city of, smaller size like Cleveland or mid-size, there is a big, big opportunity. And, the issue is getting savvy on what are contracts that are coming up and, are open for bid. Where might there be a business problem that these anchors have that local businesses can help solve? Where might there be a case where, as there is in Cleveland, with record storage, the whole city is basically doing business with one monopoly that came in and bought up all the small record storage companies. And there's a general, and we don't need to name the name of the company, but there's a general feeling when you talk to people in all kinds of institutions around the city, law firms, the city government, the universities, the hospitals, that they're kind of being gouged financially. So they would love another alternative. And there are lots of those kinds of things. When you study these institutions, which look so sort of monolithic from the outside, and you can get in there, you can find there are a lot of opportunities that could drive business locally. And, it's something, again, they're just increasingly embracing, and for good self-interested reasons, including it makes them look very good. When university hospitals did this $1.2 billion project I talked about, when the project was done, they took out a full-page ad 2 times in the Cleveland Plain Dealer listing all of the local small businesses that had participated on this Vision 2010 project. And, that was good for those small businesses because it gave them something in their resume so they could go to their next, customer and say, look, we did business with university hospitals, one of the most important institutions in the city. But it was clearly very good for university hospitals to be able to say, for instance, to the mayor, look, we're good civic, citizens, look what we did here, and there's the evidence right there to prove it. So it really is a win all the way around.
Thank you. That's very helpful. And Steve, do you have anything to add?
Well, I think there's a lot of opportunities, in terms of one sort of, in sort of a statistical sense. If you looked at the examples we gave, they range from, say, 10% to 20% of the market. So you take that, and this is what's actually been achieved in different communities. So, if the institutions that you're working with haven't achieved that, that's certainly possible. Miami Dade over 20%. So if you figure 10 to 20% of $1 trillion nationally, and you get a pretty good number of, somewhere we're looking at, total market share, and it's certainly in excess of $100 billion. So it's not insignificant. And then there is no substitution for doing the kind of market research that Ted was referring to.
Great. So we've got another good question here. Describe, and we've got maybe 3 or 4 minutes to answer that question, unless there's other ones that pop up. So we've talked a lot about how to equip small businesses to better compete, and so we've gone through that in other webinars as well. Steve, you've mentioned some of those things today. what happens with existing private contractors? Can you recap a bit of how they might push back when some of their market share goes to local businesses, and how might somebody be prepared to deal with that?
Yeah, it's interesting. I'll share out one example from fairly famous example of Penn, and I forget if the vendor involved was Office Depot or Staples, but it was one of those large office supply vendors. And one thing to note is that they more often lose business to other large vendors rather than to the small vendors. So that's and Penn Purchasing Services was able to play with this, and they were able to, say, well, if you want to, and it's fairly standard, if you want to have a contract with Penn, you have to have a, local business subcontractor, and it was a minority-owned business, and they did that. And then 5 years later, the Penn Purchasing Service was able to say, well, we think, I think it's called Telrose, if I remember the name of the vendor correctly. They now have the capacity to be the lead vendor, but you can still be a sub-vendor to them. So the choice for, we'll pretend it was Office Depot. I'm not sure that was the case, but the choice for the vendor was having a contract where now they were the sub-vendor or having no contract. And so they were willing to do that, and they saw this as providing long-term stable business with the university, and that was worth the cost of no longer being the prime vendor. So that's sort of the trade-off that's at least in that case, the institution is able to successfully implement.
Nothing else from you, Steve? Ted?
Well, the only thing I'd add is, and I got so clear about this in the case study research we were doing in university hospitals, if you're looking at this as an institutional procurement strategy linked to anchor institutions, I think the way to orient ourselves is to be thinking along the lines of, look, the owner of this activity is the institution itself. It has, it clearly has the right to say to its vendors, this is what we want. We don't want this kind of product because it's not environmentally sustainable. If you're going to work with us, you need to do X. And it's their money, the institution's money, they're going to spend it so they can determine how things are going to be done. And we could look at this in the sense of, well, who are these institutions to throw their weight around? And there could be a whole democratic question there. But the reality is that's the way it works. So the important thing is to get in dialogue with these institutions so that when they, in a sense, do use their weight or do exhibit themselves as owners, they are, in a sense, doing the right thing. So, they have the opportunity to simply look for the least cost for the product and buy it anywhere. But we know the right thing is drive the business local, put people in the community to work, patronize the local small businesses. And, if there's going to be heat, the institution will feel it. But in truth, it's just as Steve said, vendors want that work. And if what the institution says is, if you want this work, you have to do the following things, the truth is the large corporations that want the work, they're going to do it, and then they're going to sub it out to local smaller businesses and be environmental and so forth. So the money really does speak here, and it's a question of leveraging it for community benefiting purposes and for living local economies.
Great. Thank you. So I'll just say in wrap-up that I think our November webinar, which featured an example from Phoenix, was particularly strong in this area at kind of answering the challenges or the knee-jerk reactions from, in this case, a government agency, but I think it could very easily come from other anchor institutions, and really exploring how it's not just about cost. That they looked at a number of state contracts and found that the state was going out for bid to the lowest cost in terms of that bid, but the state was actually losing millions of dollars because those bids, when they were going to out-of-state companies, the multiplier of where that company was spending its money was so much lower, that the charity the business was doing, that when they just looked at the pricing of that individual contract, they were actually losing millions in state dollars. And so it's just a more complicated picture that we're beginning to help folks understand in terms of all the positive impacts that can come from local procurement. So with that, I think we're just over time. So again, we're going to move our conversation in the next few months to really going deep on getting food, in particular into hospitals, universities, K through 12, schools, restaurants, and retail. So we'll start to explore the kind of food piece of procurement in a bit more detail. So watch for details on our website, www.bealocalist.org. Watch again for today's recording and a copy of the questions from our chat and the slides from Ted and Steve. So you'll get that in the next day or two. And in the meantime, I just really want to thank Ted and Steve for all of your time in helping us start to develop our local procurement resources and conversation. So thanks very much, guys.
Thank you, Alyssa, and thanks to BALLE.
All right. Well, happy Tuesday, everyone, and we hope to have you join us for our conversation next month, the first Tuesday of April. So thanks, everyone, for the great questions. Take care.